So I'm actually delighted to be joined by Steve Page. And Steve, thank you so much for joining me. On your very modest, I have to say, your very modest bio, you are MBA CP, which you can tell me what that means in a second, because well, you're having to recall as well, wouldn't you? Has a coaching and counselling practice in Sheriff Hutton in North Yorkshire. Beautiful. Graduated in chemistry in 1976, and your career spans therapeutic communities, private practice, and senior student support management roles in 2 universities. Co-author with Val Waskett of Supervising the Counsellor and Psychotherapist in 2014, and the author of The Shadow and the Counsellor in 1999. And actually, what struck me was, somehow, I'm not quite sure how, Steve, but I kind of felt like the Shadow book came later, and I realized it's amazing how fresh ideas stay still. I mean, this book now is 22 years old, and it still feels as vibrant and fresh. When you, as an author, how do you look back at your corpus of work, and how do you sort of make sense of it? I know, your profile says you're sort of moving into sculpture now and leave it. So I've caught you at the cusp of your career in a sense. How do you make sense of this whole trajectory?
Well, first of all, the first edition of Supervising the Counsellor came out in 1994.
Right.
So it predated the Shadow book. And I suppose, how do I look back on it? Well, I look back on it as a kind of being in the right place at the right time, actually. Because Supervising the Counsellor came about because Mary Connor, who was the director of counselling studies at York St John University, was then the College of Wickham and York St John, and was a major player in counsellor training across the UK at the time. She was well recognised, and Routledge were wooing her to write a book about counsellor training. And when they came up to take her out to dinner, I think, they said, "And do you have any colleagues who'd like to write a book about supervision?" And at the time, Val was leading the supervision course, and it was probably one of not very many at that point. And I was one of the kind of associates that they brought in to do some of the group work stuff, and some of the work on the course. And so Mary asked Val, and Val said, "I'm not doing it on my own." She instantly, but she said, "If Steve will do it with me, I'll do it." And I'd recently done my master's, which is why I ended up at York St John, master's in counselling. And so that's why they knew me, and that's how Val had come to invite me onto that program. So we ended up being asked to write a book. I mean, that doesn't happen very often to many people, particularly at the stage that Val and I were at. Really, we were making our way at that point, in probably both in our early 40s. So we were kind of a bit early in that, late 30s. So still at that kind of stage. And it was only actually having done my master's that I learned I could write, because, as you said, I graduated in chemistry. When you're a chemist, you don't write. You don't write in a kind of creative way, in a particularly articulate way. You write reports.
Yeah.
And I'd done maths, physics, chemistry, so I hadn't really kind of ever developed that, and I didn't know if I could write. So I always remember taking my first assignment to Mary Connell's office, and literally the sweat was pouring down my back as I went to hand it in. I had no idea what she would say about it, and she gave it a distinction, and it was like, "What? What's happening here?" And actually doing that master's was where I kind of started to gain confidence in my ability to be articulate on paper. So, and supervision, I'm not sure how far to keep going with the question. I mean, I was introduced to supervision when I was 22. So I'd gone to work for an organisation called Richmond Fellowship that ran therapeutic communities. And if you wanted to kind of continue in Richmond Fellowship, you asked to be put on the the senior staff training program. And the first and major part of the senior staff training program was a 3-month placement at the training house, which was a therapeutic community for adults. I was working on teenagers, but a therapeutic community for adults. And a major part of that 3 months was supervision training. So I had weekly supervision with a supervisor who's on the core team. I supervised one of my fellow trainees. They supervised, and another one supervised me. And supervision was absolutely central to that whole program. And just to kind of do a bit of supervision history in the UK, the staff team at the training house at that point was Peter Hawkins, Joan Wilmot, Robin Showett, Andrew Forrester. They were the core team of 4. So Robin Showett was my first supervisor, and Peter was my second.
You were with the masters, the fathers
Exactly.
of the profession.
Exactly. Yeah. They were very much developing their thinking around supervision.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Steve. So I mean, it's interesting. In a sense, we've talked about the start of your career, and now you're at the very cusp of, in a sense, I don't know whether you said leaving that career behind to move into your sculpture. When you look back now, how do you feel about where you are and the transition you're about to make, either away from or reducing that work?
It's a good question. To put me in context, and the question you didn't ask because you're too polite. So I'm 66. So I've just started getting paid money by the Chancellor to carry on breathing. I think it's wonderful. And so how do I feel about it? I feel quite mixed. I have actually wound down the supervision. I've got one supervisor at the moment who's stuck under the wire, and another contract with someone which is a kind of mix of counselling and supervision. But essentially, I've stopped supervising, or I'm stopping supervising. I've stopped training. Did my last training a few weeks ago, and I feel sad about it. I mean, supervision has been such an integral part of my whole career. It's the only thing I've done throughout the whole time since I was 22. And I do miss it. I will miss it. But on the other hand, I felt if I'm going to start reducing my work, I didn't want to become one of those people who doesn't practice but supervises.
Yeah.
So I kind of feel, well, I've written that I don't really agree with that. So how can I justify doing it? And so really the choice was either I stop completely or I do what I'm doing, which is I carry on with a small counselling and coaching practice, but I stopped the supervision and training, or I carried on working flat out and didn't get time to do the other things I want to do.
Yeah.
And, I decided I really did want to. I thought I will regret doing that because I've had a really good go at all the things I love doing in terms of work. I've been very, very lucky throughout my career, I feel. So, and also I feel there is an element of actually while the old lags like me hang around, it actually makes it harder for the next generation to really claim their authority.
Yeah.
And I think we do need a new generation. I'm not criticizing anybody else in saying that.
Sure.
I think, it's great to have some people who are the kind of recognized, grandfathers and grandmothers of the supervision profession, really, this part, still working. But if there are too many of us, I think it does clog it up. And we are, in a sense, I consider myself, in a sense, slightly at the back end of the first generation, as it were. I wasn't right at the first generation, but I was close. I was kind of a few years later.
You were the Saint Paul.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah,
Oh.
there were lights in Paul really. Sorry to Paul. Sorry. But yeah, okay, that'll do.
Well, thanks, Steve. I mean, it's interesting with these kind of conversations. You don't know where they're going to go, really. I mean, we've got some idea of where we're going to explore, but it's as I was talking to you then, I was just struck by the fact that I have, for whatever reason, caught you at this kind of cusp. And I think it's really important to recognize for somebody watching this who's either new to the profession or perhaps even reaching that same stage, like this is a journey, isn't it? It's not like I'm a supervisor, I'm a supervisor, I'm a supervisor, I'm a supervisor, I'm dead. It's like you go through a journey of letting go as well. And and I think it's kind of really quite interesting to recognize that somehow, because often we talk only about what we're doing right now. What's the new skill I need to learn, or what's the work I'm doing, or what's the piece of knowledge I want to gain, not recognizing that we're on our own life trajectory through this profession in a sense, and that's going to ebb and flow as well. So thanks for sharing that. We did say ahead of this that we're going to talk about two main themes. One was your key work in shadow, and I'd love to explore that further, particularly having just read the book, The Shadow and the Counsellor, but also your other area of interest, which is how can supervision expand beyond the one-to-one and stroke group helping professions such as coaching, therapy. Do you still feel okay with that kind of broad?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's fine.
So as you may or may not know, I represent more the coaching field rather than psychotherapy. I haven't had much involvement in psychotherapy or counselling other than reading about it. And so my background is coaching. And one of the things I'm struck by is that a lot of coaches don't particularly encounter the concept of shadow. Some do, but an awful lot of coaches won't encounter the idea of shadow. And coaching, set off to be quite a pragmatic, performance-related approach to change. And so this shadow notion didn't come into it. I wonder if perhaps we can start off by just exploring what does shadow mean to you? And I'm very aware that you were very open in saying that you didn't come from a strong Jungian background. So it wasn't like you're an expert in shadow, but you had your own sense. So just give us a bit of, meaning behind shadow for you.
Okay, so first thing about shadow is you can't put it in a wheelbarrow. It's not a thing. It's not a concrete thing. It's a concept. It's a way of articulating something about the experience, the psychological experience that we have of ourselves. That it's so that's the first thing. The second thing is it feeds off projection. It's very hungry for projection. That is to say, that process of denying something in myself and seeing it in others. Yeah. So I kind of see it in other people, but not in myself. And that helps me to keep up that process of denying. So it's important, I think, to recognize that it's a concept that's probably of more use, or it's okay to use in terms of writing about the structure of the psyche, as it were. But in day-to-day use, it's not particularly helpful to try and think about other people's shadow so much as our own.
Right.
It's much more, as practitioners, it's much more something. I mean, I think we can introduce people to the concept of shadow, so that notion that we have like unconscious parts of ourselves that can at times manifest itself through our behaviors, through our feelings. Shadow often has a very strong emotional component to it. And the other thing about it is that there is a kind of psychic energy within shadow. This is how I would understand it. Psychic energy within ourselves to actually encounter our shadow, to claim it. Because without it, we're less than fully ourselves. Yeah. There's a famous in my thinking, episode of Star Trek, one of the original ones, in which good old Jim Kirk gets in the transporter, and he gets split in two. And one part of him is all nice and kind and thoughtful and appreciative and caring. And the other part is kind of bossy and behaves totally inappropriate towards Lieutenant Avoru and is fearsome and determined. And something happens on the journey, and the nice part of Captain Cook gets the dithers, doesn't know what to do. And the other obstreperous part kind of cuts in and kind of takes command of the bridge and gets them through it. And then they find a way to kind of stick him back together. And I think that says a lot about the shadow, because it's that in the right moments, those aspects of our shadow that at other times we would say we'd rather not own, we'd rather not have, actually have an energy and a vitality about them that we lose something of ourselves if we hide them, if we suppress them, if we keep them out. So we go through this kind of journey in our lifetimes where initially, as we develop who we are ourselves, our senses, we hide some things away in order to achieve the kind of structure that we want for ourselves, given our environments and all the other stuff. And then as we get to a turning point, and we start to realize we need those other things back in order to continue that journey. We're back to the journey of development. So there is a psychic energy that tends to build probably in our late 30s, early 40s, typically. Maybe a bit later for some people, a bit earlier for others, depending on circumstance. And which is basically an internal psychic demand to kind of try and bring these two parts of ourselves back together. But they're likely to be parts of ourselves that we don't like. They're the parts of us that the I identify with doesn't like that other part of me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. Yeah. The reason why I was looking a bit curious then I was just trying to play in my mind with the logic of this integration piece. And imagine let me just play, this is my naive interpretation. So let's imagine that you begin to recognize part of your shadow that you do recognize has a strength or a use or something, and you begin to integrate it. Presumably, the logic would suggest the shadow gets smaller, but what's left in there is the very worst parts that you really don't want to integrate. It's like they're the bit you're just never going to recognize it. Does that sort of ring true, or is that just, am I seeing this in some naive way?
I think there is some truth in that. And I think that, the kind of, the nice Hollywood versions, we bring it all back together happily ever after. But yes, and actually we do see occurrences where people in the later stages of their life do actually behave in ways that are really alarming, certainly. And we might say, well, that does rather look like that part of the shadow. It's the bit that's left that they really didn't want. So I think, and I think you're making a really interesting point, because there is a tendency to think, well, once I started doing the integration piece, then, I'm a kind of nicer person. And actually, I'm a nicer person until I'm not. I think
Right.
it's probably a better way of thinking about it. Or I'm more the person I would like to be until I'm not. I had an example of this recently. I'll tell you this because it might be helpful to. So I'll try and tell you succinctly as possible. So someone sent me a document to look, which was a contractual document, a piece of work, which actually I'd already done my part in. So it's a contractual document between organisation A and organisation B. It was organisation B who contracted with me to do this piece of work. And I started reading it, and this was a contractual document from organisation A with organisation B. But organisation B, someone said, well, we'll send it to Steve so he can have a look at it and check that he's okay with it. And I read about half of it and blew my top. I was furious because I felt like they were it was a whole section about intellectual property in it. And it felt like they were trying to claim rights over my work. And thereby, I had this vision of it kind of ending up in a box on a dusty shelf, and that's the last thing I want at the moment with anything that I'm doing. Anything that I've got to say, I want to give it away. I want it out there so that other people who want to can pick it up and use it. And if they don't want to, fine. But if they want to, I want them to be able to. So I kind of rocketed up this email to a couple of people in the organisation. There were people I knew. And I sent this really kind of explosive email, having a tantrum, basically, which was followed. And as soon as I'd sent it, I thought, oh, for goodness sake, Steve, you really shouldn't have sent that. You should have thought about this a bit more. And by the way, you should have finished reading the document before you actually sent it. So I sent them a second one immediately, which was saying, oh, I'm really sorry. That was really bad of me. And please ignore it. Give me a few days. I will read the whole document and then I'll give you my considered view about it. The one of them replied saying, that's fine, Steve. So, but it was, the thing about it was I was enraged. I was enraged at this idea of something of me being kind of shut away. Now, okay. So then, and you might think, well, how do you know that shadow stuff? Well, I'll tell you how I know. So I then, a couple of weeks later, I read through the whole document. And there towards the end of it was a section where it was being agreed that Organisation B could license anybody they wanted to use this material. So my anxiety was going to be stuck in a box on the shelf. It's like, well, Organisation B can now do whatever they want with it. They can let anyone they want use it. That's exactly what I want to happen. So, and that's the bit. It's like, oh, for goodness sake, it was there. It was in there.
And it's the emotional component that tells you.
The emotional charge. That's what tells you. It was just rage. Now, why am I raging about that? Okay, well, actually, the reason I'm raging is because there's a part of me that wants to hide. That's what I was raging against. Part of me that wants to hide, I'm projecting it. They want to hide. Actually, it's the part of me that wants to hide. The part of me that wants to get out there, be out there and be seen was raging. That's what was actually going on.
Oh, fascinating.
Psychic level within me, I'm sure. I'm pretty sure that's what was actually happening, because that's where the charge came from. And so it's kind of,
and
I'm
really fascinating.
I hadn't sorted it yet.
Yeah. Give it a few more years, you'll be fine.
Another 22.
So I actually first came across I think I've come across the shadow many years ago, but I think I first came across it in a very detailed sense in the book, How in the Helping Professions by Guggenbill Craig. And I thought that was a wonderful book. And in particular, it made me think about what are the hidden drivers behind why somebody enters the helping profession. In his case, obviously psychoanalysis, I believe he was a psychoanalyst. In our case, counselling, or in my case, coaching, or whatever it might be. And I'm curious, if we start to take this shadow concept into our field of the helping professions, what's your sense of the importance of that work within supervision, and that coaches stroke counsellors need to start to think about in terms of themselves?
Okay. So it's partially a question about motivation. And it's partially a question about supervision. I think it's hard hearing.
Yeah.
So I think my first thing is, I think it is helpful for all of us to recognize that if we have a desire to be in the helping professions, it's a good idea for us to ponder and think, what is it in us that means we want to do that? Because it won't be totally selfless. It absolutely will not be, ever. It just, human beings aren't made like that. we're a kind of mix of, I mean, yes, of course, we're capable of wonderful acts of altruism. And I think that's been one of the most uplifting aspects of the pandemic, is hearing those kind of stories of generosity, of self-sacrifice, all that.
Shadow.
Yeah, got it. The lights decided to go out. Put you into shadow. Um, but our motivation will never be purely altruistic. There will be self-driven aspects to it, some of which are likely to be murky in the sense that they could do harm, and they could do harm to others if they're left to act unchecked. And they will gradually emerge, whether we want them to or not. They will find ways out. They don't want to be trapped. They're a part of our psyche and they want to express themselves. So therefore, it's a good idea for us to be involved in having some awareness of them. Supervision. Well, I think there's two things about supervision I want to, in relation to what you're saying. One is, I think it's a place where, as supervisors, we can introduce people to the concept of shadow without accusing them of anything.
Mm.
I think it's not unhelpful when there's an opportunity, and often the best opportunities as a supervisor to introduce their concept are when there's an example of our own.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And there's all sorts of, the evidence that supervisees just are so hungry for their supervisors not to be on a pedestal, but to actually like them be flawed human beings.
Mm.
And if the opportunity arises, something emerges, something happens that we can name in that way, then I think that's a useful thing to do, because it introduces the concept and it gives a little bit of permission. And that kind of self-disclosure almost invariably is valuable to the supervisory relationship. The self-disclosure where we tell our supervisee how wonderful we are, how marvelous we are, is not helpful to the supervisory relationship. Surprise, surprise. So, and then I think the other thing in supervision, don't think we should start saying, "Well, I think that's your shadow," but I think we can point out patterns. We can point out, "Well, that's interesting. That happened. That kind of reminds me of something you were telling me a few months ago with another client. Yeah, well, this happened. Is that, can you remember? Is that right? Have I got that right?" Just bring it in. As a kind of, there might be a little bit of a theme here emerging, because I always think in terms of supervision, there's two time tracks running in supervision. There's an immediate short-term time track where we're looking often at a very specific piece of client work that the person is currently involved in, or the work that they are currently involved in.
Yeah.
And we hope that the conversation in supervision will enhance that work in some way, that the reflection that we have together will, better that work in some way. That's the immediate, that's the short wave. The longer wave is the development of the practitioner. And that can take place over months and years. And shadow work certainly, I think, comes into that. It's not usually immediate. I mean, yes, something might erupt.
Yeah.
But it's so I think it's our role as supervisors, I think, is to kindly, gently, compassionately introduce the notion and encourage our supervisees to reflect on things that happen in their professional lives.
I was thinking, just as you said, compassionately, just the word that came up for me was that actually this shadow notion allows us to be compassionate about somebody's behaviors and their drivers, because we all have shadows. And at the same time, we have a responsibility to the client or the system we're part of as a supervisor. And I'm curious where somebody's very resistant to the idea of a shadow at play. To what extent, as supervisors, do we have to kind of step into that to kind of break through any resistance? they just won't look at, where they might be doing something inappropriate in some way.
Well, there certainly is a role for us to challenge in supervision and occasionally to say, whoa, enough. Actually, I'm sorry, but in my view, that's not okay. What you're doing now, whatever it is. And I want you to stop. That's, we're at that point, the supervisory relationship is under serious threat. We take that level of authority. But yeah, no, I think sometimes, it's happened very rarely in my experience as a supervisor, but there have been certainly a handful of situations where I've said to someone, nah, not okay. And in a couple of times where I've said to someone, you need to stop. I don't think I've ever said to someone, you've got to stop forever.
Yeah.
In my view. But I have a couple of times said, I don't think you're fit at the moment to continue working. And that's been hard. But certainly in the most recent case, when I did it, they found it really tough when I said it. And 3 months later, we're absolutely delighted.
Yeah.
Because they said, well, I couldn't see what state I was in. You saw it. You called me out on it. Yeah. And if you hadn't, goodness knows what would have happened. So, yeah.
Within our professions, Steve, you talk about 7 containers, and I won't ask you to dredge your memory back to necessarily naming them all. I've got a nice little list here, which I'll just reel off just for the listener. So you talk about 7 containers being the contracted relationship, and the agreed relationship between in our case, my case, coach and client, the consciously chosen technique, whether that's like from an existential background or person-centered or whatever, and the model you're using. Third container is supervision itself. Fourth is the codes of practice that govern that particular profession. Fifth is personal therapy, or perhaps personal coaching, if it's. Sixth is your personal life, which I found intriguing and excellent. You brought that in a sense. It's something we forget, that the personal life can become a container, of course. And then finally, the organizational systemic context for the work. And I thought that was for me as a supervisor, looking for, well, okay, this shadow thing feels very amorphous. This feels like a very structured way of doing the work. And then a flip question came to me, which I shared with you in my email, which was, to what extent can these be the amplifiers of shadow? In other words, if you are so committed to a psychodynamic approach, or you're so committed to there's got to be an existential thing here somewhere, or you have your own stuff going on in your life, you're just going through a divorce or whatever it might be, or whatever it might be. I'm curious on your take on those 7 as containers 22 years later after writing them, and also my notion of them as amplifiers, and just any thoughts on that, really.
Okay. So the way I understand them as containers now, I didn't reread that section before we started speaking. There's something strange about having written a book that was published 22 years ago. Half my career ago.
Yeah.
Feels like. They're containers in the sense that they hold us to task to some extent, but also if we are pushing against them or stepping across them, that should be cause for question. If I'm deliberately doing something that goes against my chosen approach, then why am I doing that? What's going on that I'm doing that? If I'm deliberately stepping outside of the contract, if I'm not doing what it says in my code of practice or my ethical framework, whatever, what's that about? What's that saying to me? How should I understand that? And there might be occasions when it's appropriate to do all those things, but very rare occasions. But it also may be that that's a signal that I'm doing something here that I need to ask seriously. So in that sense, they contain.
Yes.
They don't force us, but they kind of set off a bell.
Yeah.
You step across that particular fence and the alarm starts ringing. But also equally, yes, if I obsessively stick to the contract, even though it's becoming clear that it's actually not serving the client or the work, what's that? Well, I'm using the contract to do something else that's driven by me in some way. Why? Where's that from? So yes, in that sense, it can be an amplifier. Any one of these can be an amplifier. I might be not paying enough attention to my clients because actually I'm spending far too much time out too late at night with my mates because I'm having a wonderful time, or not having a wonderful time, but still my personal life is actually encroaching on my work. So it's not containing, it's actually imploding into. So they're not kind of guaranteed as containers, but they offer that facility in the right set of circumstances.
Yes. I think
I think your point is well made.
Yeah, I think for me as a supervisor, they're really, really, it's excellent framework. I would just, it seems so simple when you read it, you think, of course, but it just offers a very neat way of looking at where are the clues, and also what might be impacting this person's here and now work with the client. And the time is ticking on as it does. And I wonder if perhaps we can finish up this stage on the shadow by just thinking about the idea of the shadow as a guide, which is you've got these 6 stages: forming the shadow, denying the shadow, recognizing the shadow, confronting the shadow, incorporating the shadow, and then shadow as guide. And I love this idea of shadow as guide. And I wonder if you can just share a few more thoughts on that.
Well, let's go back to my example. So I don't think my little outburst, my little temper tantrum did any harm. I don't think it did. Or any significant harm anyway. Might have been, look, what's up? But it brought me up short and made me think, what's happening here? What's going on here? And then when I actually did, it was really interesting. When I sat down to read the contract, made myself a cup of coffee, said to myself, right, I'm going to go and read that contract. Made a cup of coffee, sat down in the seat, read it through all the way, found the clause that said they can give it away. And it was like, oh, okay, that's really interesting. So what's this about? And it is about my desire to give away. And then a few days later, you emailed me and said, would I be willing to do this podcast? And I'm not entirely sure I would have said yes if I hadn't had that experience. And that, therefore, it's fresh in my memory. It was a kind of reminder that I want opportunities to give away the stuff that I've done or, whatever. I want opportunities to, and actually it's to kind of give back. Yeah, the profession has been incredibly generous to me in many, many ways. So when your inquiry came through, and I was kind of knackered at the time, wasn't I? Said I need time to think about this, but because my instant reaction was no, was I was absolutely exhausted from having done that final training session, and so I had and it's like, so it was there. It was the counter to the part of me that was exhausted. It was the counter saying, hang on, this is an opportunity for you to share some of what you have. So don't just dismiss it. Take some time to think about it rather than just follow your instinct. So in that sense, I think my shadow was guiding me.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And it's really funny how, in a sense, for me, how a shared thing can happen without even realizing. Because when I got your bio this morning, and I was like, oh, 1999, I haven't realized it's written so long ago. And the thought that came to me is, and then that you're moving into sculpture, the thought that came to me was, it's really beautiful that book's going to outlive your involvement in the profession. You might be there doing a sculpture, but somebody's reading your book. And I thought, how beautiful is that, really? So it's funny that that's also part of your current sort of dialogue, self-dialogue here.
Oh, yes. I love that. I absolutely love it. I got an email a couple of weeks ago from someone who'd done a workshop with me in 17 or 18, saying they just wants to let me know that one particular exercise that we've done in the workshop, something had come up for them in that, which has absolutely been enormously helpful for them. And they've been meaning to write to me for ages. And it was like, oh, yes. And it was a shadow workshop. And it's moving. And I do, it does feel like it's legacy. The books feel like they're out there.
Yeah.
They're doing what they're doing. And I can get on with doing what I do.
Yeah. So let's move on to the final section, and we'll keep this somewhat brief for you because it's already 45 minutes. I really, really appreciate your time. And it's just your idea of how does supervision transcend the boundaries of the specific help and profession, be that coaching supervision, counselling supervision. And the question that came up for me, I recently reread Supervision as Transformation, and that has a number of different approaches to supervision that you wouldn't necessarily call, or at least I wouldn't necessarily call supervision. And I thought, so what makes supervision other than the fact you're focusing on the supervisee's work? And I wonder if you might share, what does supervision mean to you? That means that there's a sort of a role to play that's not just about the individual client stroke supervisee.
Okay. I think, yes, it's focused on the person's work. It's a reflective process. At least part of the time is reflective. So we're looking back in some way what has happened in order to inform going forward. So it's that kind of backward, forward movement, I think. I mean, that's my take on supervision. And it has a long-term developmental function for that person. So it's not just a discrete piece of facilitation around a very particular thing that's happened. It's also got that longer-term development element to it.
Yeah.
That to me.
Yeah, great. I wonder if you could share a little bit more about where you would love to see it. I mean, do you see this as being something that should be everywhere, or do you see particular pockets where a supervisory approach would really play a role?
Okay. You have a question that you wrote down, which was, where would you love to see supervision have a role? And I had a great response to that because my first thought was the cabinet. That we're in the months, interesting things having just happened. But I mean, to be serious about it, I think it's anywhere where it can contribute to a culture of learning. Where we want there to be a culture of learning, supervision can make a contribution. Because that reflective process, that looking together, looking with a colleague or colleagues, looking at what we've done and reflecting upon it and thinking about what that tells us and what we might learn from it, seems to me feeds a learning culture. And learning cultures are, I feel very passionately about. That's what, going back to that kind of development, career kind of stuff. It's like, we want everybody to be engaged in their own learning, to recognize that they're on the journey, that they're learning throughout their lifetime. Because that brings about an openness, a willingness to change, all those things that, as coaches, we often come up against, where people don't want to learn, they don't want to change, they want it to all remain the same. And so anywhere where I think where a learning culture is valuable.
I sometimes wonder if let me give my idea to you so we think, Steve. But I sometimes wonder if the distinction between, say, supervision and coaching, because coaching could be argued to be a learning, reflective approach, but it feels the supervision has this systemic lens that's about, well, it's not only the person in front of me I have to care about, but the people that they're looking after in some way, whether that's as a boss or as a coach or whatever. Is that kind of part of the picture for you when it comes to supervision, or is it? I'm just kind of curious on that, because coaching definitely has a learning reflective edge. So I'm trying to think, what's that supervision difference?
Yes. Yes. I think that's a nice. I mean, I haven't really thought about it quite in that way. So I need to. Are there any examples where that's not the case? But in principle, I think it is. Yes, it involves what the supervisee is doing with someone else in another setting, not just for themselves, or not just their not just their work or whatever it is in itself, but there's another layer.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, great.
It's that matrix. So I was thinking of the Hawkins and Showett, and you've got the kind of, you've got the client and you've got the supervisee and then you've got the supervisor, one way around or the other, that image.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, perfect. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your time. It's been, honestly, I was so delighted when you said yes. I knew, I know what it's like to go through training, to train people and then feel that exhaustion. So I was delighted you took a couple of days to think about it and come back to me. So thank you. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much indeed, Steve.
Not at all. It's been a pleasure for me too.